Hello and welcome to our study of the book of Esther. There are two sessions to this study, so this is the first one. And we're going to be looking at Esther chapters 1 through 4 today and try to understand what this book is about and why it is so important. Now, first thing I want to do is I want to mention that the Jewish people even today celebrate what's called Purim, P-U-R-I-M. And that comes from the Hebrew word lots, and it has to do with the casting of lots, because that was the day in which Haman, the villain of this story, decided on which the extermination of the Jews in the Persian Empire would take place. And it didn't happen. And so Purim is a celebration of that fact. And even to this day, when the book of Esther is read during the celebration of Purim, the villain Haman is booed. So anyway, this book is about the providence of God. And what is the providence of God? Well, here's how one person has defined it. The providence of God means that in some inscrutable and invisible way, God is moving in all of history toward its final end in Christ through the normal and ordinary course of human life, even without the intervention of miracles. So, this book, Esther, is one example of the providence of God. This is what somebody says. In the book of Esther, we see a clear manifestation of the providence of God as God, whose name is not even actually mentioned in the book of Esther, delivers the Jewish people in exile. They're in exile in the Persian Empire from the machinations of those seeking to exterminate them. And of course, the lead person in that is the villain Haman. So here's what we want to do. We want to get the historical background for the book of Esther. We want to get to know the key players in the book of Esther and the main events of Esther. And then we will look at Esther and understand it verse by verse. So to understand the background of Esther, we need to go back in history to 722 BC, when the Assyrian Empire, which was the dominant empire of the day, attacked the Jewish nation in Israel and carted off the 10 tribes, the northern 10 tribes of Israel, and mixing them with the people of the Assyrian Empire, leaving only those who were in the southern part near Jerusalem. And so that would be the major tribe of Judah and the minor tribe of Benjamin. And Benjamin was actually absorbed by Judah. And it's from Judah that we get the word Jews. So they were the only ones left. Now the Assyrians didn't last. They were overtaken by the Babylonian Empire. And so the Babylonian Empire came, and in 586 BC, they defeated the remaining Jews who were in Judah, and they carted off many of them to the Babylonian Empire. But they were different than the Assyrians. The Assyrians mixed up the Jews with the pagan people that were there. The Babylonians allowed them to maintain their religion throughout the empire, even in exile. And now along comes the Persians, and the Persians conquer the Babylonians. So the Jews are now living in exile, many of them throughout the Persian Empire. Along comes the Persian king Cyrus, and he does something very positive for the Jewish people. He allows them to return to Jerusalem, to live there and to rebuild the temple there. And so many do. They go back to Jerusalem. And we read about that in the book of Ezra. But there are many people, many Jewish people, who remain scattered about the Persian Empire. And these are the ones who are the characters and the players of the book of Esther. So the book of Esther is written about, or the events take place about 473 BC. And it's about these people that I've talked about and God's providential care of these people and his protection of them, and the plots that surface. So now we have the historical setting, the names, the main characters. Well, one is this beautiful Jewish girl named Hadassah, who also goes by her Persian name of Esther. And then there is her cousin, who, because Esther her parents die, and her cousin Mordecai becomes not just her cousin, but also her guardian, and one who gives her much advice. Then, of course, another key player here is Xerxes. Xerxes is the present king of the Persians at this time, and his capital is in Susa. Vashti is his queen. We meet her early on, and then she disappears from the scene. And of course, the villain, whose name is Haman, who is actually the second in charge in the empire. So these are the characters, and they are all flawed characters. Even Mordecai and Esther, who are the main Jewish characters here, they're flawed characters. One person has used the word morally ambiguous. Sometimes we don't know what their motives are. Just like us, they have mixed motives. They are not perfect people, even though, in a sense, they are the heroes of this story. What are the highlights? Well, the first highlight is a banquet. In fact, there are a lot of banquets in the book of Esther. The first one is a banquet in which King Xerxes is showing off his wealth, his power, and also his wife. Then, the second main event, is that Vashti, is deposed, a new queen is sought for, and Esther is chosen to be the new queen. Then, Esther's cousin, Mordecai, just happens to be in a place where he hears a plot against the king. He lets the king know about it through Esther. Haman, the second in charge, now plots to kill not just Mordecai, but all of the Jews of the empire. Mordecai persuades Esther to use her position to talk to the king, to help the Jews. Next circumstance that happens is that Xerxes has a sleepless night. He has the history of the empire read and learns that Mordecai was never rewarded for alerting the king about this plot against him. Esther points out to the king and points out to this plot that Haman has, holds another banquet, reveals Haman, and Haman is hung. And then finally, the Jews are warned throughout the empire about this plot against them to exterminate them that Haman had, and they rise up and they're victorious. And it ends then with a celebration of this fact. And every year then, Purim is celebrated. It's a happy time when the Jews remember how God providentially helped them. One person says this: the book of Esther is a story of the profound interplay of God's sovereignty and human will. So it's about the sovereignty of God, that God is doing his thing and his purposes will be accomplished. But at the same time, human beings are deciding things. Nevertheless, God's sovereignty rules over these decisions that people are making. They're making these decisions, and God is holding them responsible for them, even if they're bad decisions. But at the same time, God is having his purposes being accomplished. So that's sort of gets us ready to study the book of Esther. So let's begin. So Esther chapter 1, verse 1. This is what it says. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, and in the 3rd year of his reign he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. So Persia, modern-day Iran, but Persia then, Persia had a vast empire. It went from India on one side, even down to Ethiopia and Sudan in Africa. A huge empire. And Xerxes holds this banquet for his top officials where he wants to show off. He wants to show off just how much wealth and power he has. It says this, verse 9. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. So the king is holding a banquet. The queen is holding a banquet. The king says, I've showed off all my wealth and power. Now I'm going to show off my wife. So he sends the eunuchs. The eunuchs are the people who are able to deal with the women of the harem, where Vashti is. Go get her and bring her. And she refuses to come. And the king is angry. What's going to happen? Well, he asks his advisors. Then one of them replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and peoples of the provinces of the king. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day the Persian and Median women of nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. In other words, the advisor says, all the women of nobility, they're going to hear how Vashti refused to come to the king. And that's going to be a problem for us because they're not going to want to obey us when we tell them to do something. Wow. The king and his nobles, verse 21, were pleased with his advice, so the king did as was proposed. He sent dispatches to all the parts of the kingdom, to each province in his own script, and to each people in his own language, proclaiming in each people's tongue that every man should be ruler over his household. Goodbye to the queen. She is now deposed. And an edict goes out saying, you women, you better listen to your husbands. So what's going to happen? Will there be no queen? Well, this is what it tells us in chapter 2. Later, when the anger of the king had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for the beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful girls into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Hegi, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let all the beautiful treatments be given to them. Then let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. So let's have a beauty contest. Gather all the beautiful women. We've got a large kingdom. Take some time. This isn't going to happen overnight. And gather all the beautiful women of the kingdom to see which one might become the queen. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Among those taken captive was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. So we now meet Esther. Esther, whose cousin and whose overseer was Mordecai. This is what it says. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This girl, who was also known as Esther, was lovely in form and features, and Mordecai had taken her as his daughter. Beautiful Esther, cousin Mordecai are introduced here. Esther is one of the beautiful girls that's taken to the harem as a possible wife, new queen for Xerxes. Verse 10. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. So here she is. She's in the harem, and she's being prepared to see the king. Now, even though she's beautiful, it still tells us here in the next verse that there's a 12-month beauty treatment that she and all the girls go through before they see the king. And meanwhile, while she's there, Mordecai tells her, don't tell anyone that you are a Jew, that you're from a Jewish background. Still, he's worried about her because back and forth he paces every day trying to find out what he can hear about her. So here is Esther. She's in the harem. She's waiting out this year before she goes and sees the king and possibly becomes the new queen. Well, this is what it says in verse 17. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. She was beautiful. There was something about her that the king liked. And when she finally did make that entrance into the king and had her time with him, or his time with her, he liked her. And he decided this is the one that will be made queen. So from this time on, it's going to be Queen Esther. Meanwhile, we learn something about Mordecai. He just happens to be in a good place to hear a plot against the king. Verse 19, chapter 2. When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do so, for she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. So Mordecai has influence over Esther. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officers were hanged on a gallows. This was recorded in the book of Annals in the presence of the king. So Mordecai, he hears a plot against the king. He tells Esther. Esther tells the king's life is spared, and the two plotters are hung. Let's keep this in mind because this becomes part of the important story later on. Now we meet the villain. Chapter 3. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Haman must be a good administrator, must have had some abilities. King elevates him. He's now second in command. And the king says everyone should bow down to him and honor the place that he has. And they all do, except Mordecai. How is Haman going to respond? Well, we find out. When Haman saw, this is verse 5, that Mordecai, who he learned was a Jew, would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So he wants Haman not just to destroy Mordecai, but everybody that's connected to Mordecai by religion, who's Jewish throughout the kingdom. And from India on the one side to Cush on the other side, Sudan, Ethiopia, there would be a lot of Jewish people. And this was Haman's target. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month of Nisan, they cast the pur, that is the lot, in the presence of Haman to select a day and month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. So pur means lot. Haman cast the lot. Cast the lot like a dice, I guess, something like that. And when it landed on this particular day, then that was the day that the extermination of the Jewish people would take place. And this casting of the lots is called Purim in the Hebrew. And so that's where we get that word from. Well, what's going to happen? chapter 4. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, and what had been done was Haman had persuaded the king. He had persuaded the king that this should happen, and an edict was sent out throughout the realm. And that edict designated this day on which the enemies of the Jews could have the liberty of exterminating all of the Jewish people that were a part of the kingdom. So when Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went out only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. This is distress. That's what you do in distress. You wear sackcloth, ashes, you tear your clothing. That's what they did in this day. Verse 8. To show to Esther and to explain to her, he told her to urge her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. So when Esther interacts with Mordecai at this moment, Mordecai says to Esther, go to the king, intervene, save our people. This is what Esther says, verse 12. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, the words that, it's a dangerous thing to approach the king. Even me, I'm the queen. Actually, Xerxes hasn't even asked me to come into him for 30 days. He had a big concubine array there he could draw from his harem. And he hadn't even asked Esther to come in for 30 days. And Esther says, this is a dangerous thing to approach the king. People just didn't approach the king because they wanted to. They had to be invited to do so. And so this word goes back to Mordecai that Esther is holding back from doing so. So when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Listen to this. Do not think because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. So the first thing he says to her is, Esther, you're in the king's palace right now. You're actually the queen. But you're a Jew. When all the Jews of the kingdom are killed, it might happen to you as well. He goes on, verse 14. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. So the second thing he says to her is, even if you refuse, deliverance will come. Where's that going to come from? Well, the name God is not used here. But this is what Mordecai is talking about. God is going to do something. So we see an instance of faith in Mordecai. And then he says the third thing. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this. So the third thing is, you know what, Esther? Maybe it's just so that God's name isn't mentioned, but that God has put you in this place at this moment of time so that you can do something about this situation, that you can help in our deliverance. Verse 15. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. That would accompany praying. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, and even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Esther has taken heed to what Mordecai has said. Not sure what part of that appealed to her, but in any case, she's made the decision. Okay, I'll do it. I will go to the king and intervene. I don't know what's going to happen. I may perish. The king may not even hear me. But I'm going to do it. Well, that's where we stop for today. Next session, we want to pick this up and see what happened when she went to the king. How did it all turn out? Well, we know what happened. We know that she didn't perish. We know that the Jews weren't destroyed. But it gets even better than that. And that's what we're going to talk about next week. And then we're going to talk about how this pertains to us. We're going to see how it speaks, first of all, to the fact that God is a sovereign God, but also how God works out his purposes in our lives, allowing us to have free will, not infringing upon our free will, yet at the same time accomplishing his purposes. We'll see you then.